The day I walked out of that courtroom a free man would be the day my son lost everything he'd stolen from me. I took a deep breath of the humid Houston air, watching the rain streak down the window of my lawyer's office. 16 months. That's how long they'd kept me locked away for a crime I didn't commit. 16 months of concrete walls, fluorescent lights, and the bitter taste of betrayal that never quite left my mouth. My name is Andrew Sullivan, and I'm 59 years old. For 28 years, I built Sullivan Security Solutions from nothing into one of the most respected private security firms in Texas. But before that, I was someone else entirely. For 18 years, I was a Navy SEAL, starting as an 18-year-old kid fresh out of boot camp and rising to Senior Chief Petty Officer before I hung up my trident in 1996. You don't forget that training. Ever. In SEAL Team 4, they taught us that intelligence wins wars, not just firepower. We learned to gather information methodically, to spot patterns that others missed, to never assume anything without verification. Trust but verify wasn't just a saying, it was survival doctrine. They also taught us that sometimes the enemy wears a familiar face, that betrayal often comes from those closest to your position. I thought I'd left that world behind when I started my business, but as it turned out, those lessons would save my life decades later. My late wife, Sarah, and I had poured everything into Sullivan Security Solutions. We started it in our garage in 1996 with my Navy retirement savings and a single contract protecting a shipping facility near the Port of Houston. Sarah handled the books while I handled operations, and together we built something we could be proud of. She understood the military mindset, understood why integrity wasn't negotiable for me, why I'd rather lose a contract than compromise our standards. Sarah was the anchor that kept me steady. She'd laugh when I'd slip into mission planning mode for simple family decisions. But she also appreciated that the same discipline that made me a good SEAL made me a reliable business partner. When Christopher was born in 1994, just before I left the Navy, she made sure he understood that his father's service meant something, that the values we lived by weren't just words on a wall. We grew the company slowly, deliberately. Oil refineries needed security. Corporate executives needed protection. Government facilities needed professionals who understood operational security. By 2020, we were pulling in $9 million annually with 47 full-time employees, most of them fellow veterans who shared our commitment to excellence. When Sarah passed 3 years ago from cancer, I threw myself even deeper into the work. It was all I had left. Aside from our son, Christopher, and my grandson, Jason. The office became my sanctuary, the place where Sarah's picture still sat on my desk next to my Purple Heart and the SEAL trident she'd had framed after my retirement ceremony. Christopher had been my operations director for the past 6 years. Kid was sharp, had his business degree from University of Houston, and I'd been proud when he joined the family operation after a brief stint working for other companies. I'd tried to teach him the same values that had guided me, that your word is your bond, that loyalty flows both ways, that you protect what matters most. His wife, Michelle Rodriguez, worked as a financial consultant for various oil companies. Smart woman with an MBA from Rice, articulate and professional. They'd been married for 5 years and had a son, my grandson Jason, who was 8 years old, and the light of my life. Every Saturday we'd work on my '67 Mustang in the garage, and I'd tell him stories about his grandmother and about what it meant to be a Sullivan. Looking back, I should have seen the signs. Michelle had always been interested in our business operations, asking detailed questions about cash flow and contracts. She'd even helped us upgrade our email system 6 months after Sarah died, saying it would improve efficiency and security. I'd given her administrative access to implement the changes, thinking I was being helpful to a grieving daughter-in-law who was trying to support the family business. What I didn't know was that Michelle's consulting business had been hemorrhaging money throughout 2021. She'd invested heavily in a tech startup that collapsed, losing nearly $180,000 of borrowed money. Instead of coming to me for help, instead of admitting the mistake, she and Christopher had started planning something else entirely. They'd begun planning it 6 months after Sarah died, when grief had made me less attentive to details, when I was focused on just keeping the business running and maintaining some connection with Jason. The morning of March 15, 2023, should have been a celebration. We'd just secured the contract I'd been working toward for 18 months, a $2.8 million security agreement with Ellington Air Force Base. My military background had opened doors that money couldn't buy, and this contract would establish Sullivan Security Solutions as a premier defense contractor. I'd arrived at the office early, as always, to review the final contract details. The cherry wood desk that Sarah had picked out for my office held neat stacks of paperwork, quarterly reports showing strong growth, employee reviews for our veteran staff, and the signed Ellington contract that represented everything we'd worked for. That's when Christopher walked into my office with Michelle and 2 Harris County Sheriff's deputies. The moment I saw their faces, that old SEAL training kicked in. Threat assessment, exit routes, defensive positioning. But there was nowhere to run from what came next. "Dad, we need to talk," Christopher said, his voice flat and cold in a way I'd never heard before, not even during his teenage rebellion years. The deputies stepped forward, badges visible, hands resting casually near their service weapons, a professional stance that told me this wasn't a courtesy call. "Mr. Sullivan, you're under investigation for embezzling $450,000 from your own company," the senior deputy said. "We have bank statements showing transfers to an offshore account in your name. We have forged invoices from suppliers that don't exist. We have emails with your digital signature authorizing fraudulent payments." The words hit me like incoming fire. "This is insane, Christopher. Tell them you handle all the vendor payments. You know I would never steal from my own company, from our family's legacy." Sarah's picture seemed to stare at me from the desk, and I thought about everything we'd built together, everything I'd tried to teach him about honor and integrity. "That's exactly why this is so painful, Dad," Christopher interrupted. And I swear to God, there were actual tears in his eyes, the kind of tears that looked real but felt calculated, like a rehearsed performance. "I discovered the discrepancies 4 weeks ago during our quarterly audit. I've been working with our accountants, hoping there was some mistake, some explanation. But the evidence is overwhelming. You've been systematically stealing from your own company for the past 8 months. "That's a lie," I said, my voice carrying the command authority that had once made enemy combatants think twice. But the deputies were already moving into position, already reaching for their handcuffs. Michelle stepped closer, putting her arm around Christopher's shoulders in a gesture that looked supportive, but felt theatrical. "Sir, I know this is difficult, but we have a responsibility to Jason. We can't have his grandfather be a thief. We can't let him grow up thinking that fraud is acceptable just because it's family. They arrested me that day in the office where Sarah's dreams had lived, in the building where I'd tried to create something honorable from the skills the Navy had taught me. As they read me my rights, I caught sight of the SEAL trident on my desk, the symbol of everything I'd sworn to uphold. Honor, courage, commitment, 3 words that had guided my entire adult life, now being used against me by my own son. The bail hearing was a disaster. The district attorney argued I was a flight risk with access to offshore funds and specialized military training that made me dangerous. My lawyer at the time, a corporate attorney named Kevin Walsh, who'd handled our business contracts for years, seemed completely out of his depth in criminal court. He kept stumbling over legal terminology while the prosecutor painted me as a trained killer who'd betrayed his country's trust. Bail was set at $250,000, money I couldn't access because all my assets had been frozen pending investigation. The company accounts, my personal accounts, even the joint account I'd shared with Sarah that still had her name on it, everything was locked down. The only way to make bail was for Christopher to authorize a loan against the company, which he could do as operations director with his 30% ownership stake. He refused. "I'm sorry, Dad, but I have to think about Jason's future," he said during the brief moment they allowed us to speak. "If you're innocent, the trial will prove it. Until then, I can't risk the company's financial stability by vouching for someone accused of embezzling nearly $500,000. So I sat in pre-trial detention at the Harris County Jail, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the business suits I'd worn to build my reputation, staring at concrete walls instead of the Texas sky I'd fought to defend. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 18 years serving my country, learning to identify and neutralize threats, only to be destroyed by an enemy I'd never seen coming: my own family. I spent 3 months in Harris County Jail before the trial even began. Kevin Walsh was replaced by a public defender named Lisa Thompson, a young woman fresh out of law school who was handling her second criminal case. She meant well, but watching her prepare my defense was like watching a recruit try to field strip an M4 for the first time, technically competent, but lacking the experience to handle complications under pressure. The trial lasted 4 weeks, and every day felt like a coordinated assault on everything I'd built. The prosecution laid out their case with military precision: bank records showing transfers to an account in the Caribbean under my name, invoices from companies like Gulf Coast Security Distributors and Lone Star Equipment Solutions that investigation proved had never existed. Email chains where I supposedly authorized payments to these ghost companies, all with my digital signature. Christopher testified against me. My own son sat in that witness box and methodically destroyed my reputation. He walked the jury through our company's operational structure, explained how he'd noticed irregularities during a routine quarterly audit, how he'd confronted me privately and I'd denied everything, how he'd agonized over the decision but ultimately had no choice but to go to the authorities. "I loved my father," he said on the stand, dabbing at his eyes with a tissue that seemed to appear at exactly the right moment. "I respected everything he'd accomplished in the military and in business. But I love my son more. I couldn't let Jason grow up thinking that theft and fraud were acceptable just because it was family. My father taught me about honor and integrity, and sometimes honoring those values means making the hardest choice of your life." The jury ate it up. Here was a dutiful son, torn between loyalty to his father and responsibility to his child, forced to make an impossible choice. What they didn't see was the careful choreography, the way Christopher's voice caught at precisely the right moments, the way he avoided making direct eye contact with me except when the cameras were rolling. Michelle testified too. She talked about how I'd become distant and bitter after Sarah's death, how I'd made comments about feeling like I'd worked my whole life without enjoying the fruits of my labor, how I'd asked her about cryptocurrency investments and offshore banking strategies. She spoke about finding discrepancies in our books during the system upgrade she'd helped implement, about her growing suspicions that led Christopher to investigate further. Mr. Sullivan had been through so much, she told the jury, her voice steady but tinged with what sounded like genuine sadness. Losing his wife, feeling like the business was consuming his life. I think he convinced himself he deserved this money, that he'd earned it through decades of sacrifice. But theft is still theft, no matter how you justify it. Every word was a lie delivered with the precision of a sniper's bullet. But without concrete evidence to counter their mountain of documentation, without the resources to hire digital forensics experts or private investigators, I just looked like a guilty man making desperate excuses. The defense tried. Lisa brought in a handwriting expert who said some of the signatures looked potentially inconsistent, but couldn't definitively prove forgery. We couldn't afford the kind of technical analysis that might have exposed the email manipulation. We had no investigators to track down where the money actually went, or to verify the timeline of events. When I testified in my own defense, I tried to explain that I had no knowledge of these transactions, that Christopher and Michelle had full access to all company systems, that I'd never even heard of most of these supposed vendors. But the prosecutor painted my military background against me. Here was a man trained in deception and covert operations, someone who understood how to hide assets and cover his tracks. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor said in his closing argument, "Mr. Sullivan wants you to believe that his own son and daughter-in-law conspired to frame him for a crime they committed. He wants you to believe that these two young people, with their whole lives ahead of them, decided to destroy their family and risk prison just to steal money they could have earned legitimately. Does that sound more plausible than a bitter widower, trained in covert operations, deciding he'd earned the right to take what he wanted?" The jury deliberated for 7 hours, guilty on 8 counts of fraud and embezzlement. The judge sentenced me to 2.5 years, and with credit for time served, I had 19 months remaining. They shipped me to the Huntsville unit, a state facility 70 miles north of Houston, where I'd trade my business suits for prison whites and learn whether the discipline that had carried me through SEAL training could keep me alive in another kind of hell. Huntsville wasn't what I'd expected. The reputation painted it as a gladiator school where violence was currency and respect was earned through intimidation. But what I found was something different. Complex ecosystem where military veterans often found each other, where the same skills that had made us effective soldiers could be adapted to survive in an environment that most civilians couldn't comprehend. The first few months were brutal. Christopher sent me one letter, delivered through the prison mail system that screened every word. It said he hoped I would use this time to reflect on what I'd done, to find some peace, and that he would bring Jason to visit once I was ready to admit my guilt and apologize to our family. I wrote back one sentence: "I am innocent, and one day I will prove it." He never contacted me again. But here's what Christopher and Michelle didn't know about the Texas prison system. It has an education program that rivals some universities, and in that program, specifically in a welding certification class, I met a man who would change everything. Nicholas Martinez was 54 years old, serving the last 8 months of a 3-year sentence for his role in a VA benefits fraud scheme. Before his conviction, Nicholas had been a military intelligence analyst for the Army, serving 22 years before retiring as a master sergeant. He'd made one terrible mistake near the end of his civilian career. His ex-wife was bleeding him dry in alimony payments. His daughter needed surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. And when an opportunity presented itself to manipulate some benefit claims, he took it. The scheme collapsed, as they always do, and Nicholas found himself wearing prison whites instead of dress blues. But the same analytical mind that had made him valuable to military intelligence made him valuable to fellow inmates who needed someone who understood how systems worked, how evidence was gathered, how investigations were conducted. We were assigned to the same welding station, and during the long hours of learning to join metal with fire, we started talking. When I told him my story, something shifted in his expression, the same look I'd seen on intelligence officers when they spotted a pattern that others had missed. "Andrew," he said quietly one afternoon as we practiced bead welds on scrap steel, "everything you're describing sounds wrong. The offshore account, the ghost companies, the email trail. It's too clean. Real embezzlement is messy because people get greedy. They make mistakes. They leave gaps. This sounds like someone who knows exactly how investigations work set you up." "My son is an operations guy, not a criminal mastermind," I said bitterly, the welding torch heavy in my hands. "Maybe not, but his wife is a financial consultant. Think about it. She had administrative access to your email system. She understands how digital evidence works, and if she was desperate enough, she might have seen this as the only way out of whatever hole she'd dug." Nicholas leaned closer, lowering his voice even though the industrial noise of the welding shop made eavesdropping nearly impossible. Listen to me carefully. You need a better lawyer, and you need someone who can do real forensic work. But since you can't afford that right now, you need to become your own investigator. The skills you learned as a SEAL, intelligence gathering, pattern recognition, systematic analysis, they all apply here. I can teach you what to look for. For the next 13 months, Nicholas Martinez became my professor in a course they don't teach at any university: How to Prove Your Own Innocence. We turned the prison library into our intelligence center, using my limited computer access to research corporate fraud cases, to understand the techniques prosecutors used and the mistakes real criminals made. Nicholas showed me how to file Freedom of Information requests to get copies of all the evidence used in my trial. It took weeks of bureaucratic wrestling, but eventually boxes of documents arrived at the prison library. We spread them across the metal tables like intelligence analysts planning a mission, going through every bank statement, every invoice, every email with the methodical precision that had once been used to track enemy movements. In military intelligence, we call it pattern analysis, Nicholas explained as we sorted through the financial records. Real criminals leave signatures in their work, habits, preferences, mistakes that repeat. But manufactured evidence has different patterns. It's too perfect, too convenient. Look for things that don't fit human behavior. The first crack appeared in the offshore account documentation. Nicholas noticed the account opening date, February 12, 2022. I had been in San Antonio that entire week for a veterans conference, the annual gathering of SEAL Team 4 alumni that I hadn't missed in 15 years. I had flight records, hotel receipts, even photos from the event that I'd posted on Facebook with timestamps. You can't open a Caribbean bank account from a hotel conference room in San Antonio, Nicholas said, highlighting the dates with a yellow marker. This is sloppy work. Whoever set this up didn't account for your travel schedule. The ghost company invoices were even more revealing when we applied systematic analysis. Nicholas taught me to look beyond the obvious, not just at whether the companies existed, but at the subtle details that revealed their construction. The fonts were slightly different from our legitimate supplier invoices. The formatting was inconsistent. Most telling, the company registration numbers, when we looked them up through online databases, belonged to real companies, but in different states entirely. Classic intelligence operation mistake, Nicholas explained. They took shortcuts, used real registration numbers but attached them to fake company names. It works for surface inspection but falls apart under detailed analysis. Your daughter-in-law is smart, but she's not trained in operational security. But the emails were where we found the smoking gun. Nicholas taught me about metadata, the hidden information, embedded in every digital file that most people never think about, but that intelligence agencies use to track communications. We filed a formal request for the complete digital forensics report from my trial, not just the summary that had been presented to the jury. When the full report finally arrived after months of legal wrangling, Nicholas spread the technical analysis across our workspace like a treasure map. "Look at this," he said, pointing to lines of code that meant nothing to me but everything to him. The email metadata shows they were created from your office computer, but check the timestamps and IP addresses. I leaned over his shoulder as he walked me through the technical details. These emails were supposedly sent during business hours when you were at the office, but the IP address logs show they were actually created from a residential internet connection in Katy, Texas. "Where do Christopher and Michelle live?" "Katy," I said, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Now cross-reference these dates, March through September 2022, with your calendar and travel records. I pulled up my appointment logs from that period, documents I'd managed to preserve through my lawyer. During the entire time frame when the fraudulent emails were supposedly sent, I'd been working primarily from client sites implementing our new Air Force base contract. Christopher had been the primary person at our office, handling coordination with field teams and managing day-to-day operations. She had administrative access to your email system, Nicholas said quietly. With Christopher's help, she could have logged into your account remotely from their home and created these emails with backdated timestamps to make them appear as if they'd been sent months earlier. The pattern was becoming clear, but proving it required resources I didn't have. That's when fate intervened in the form of a phone call I'd never expected to receive. Patrick Coleman had been my platoon sergeant during my final deployment with SEAL Team 4. We'd kept in touch over the years. Holiday cards, occasional phone calls, the kind of distant but enduring connection that military brothers maintain. Patrick had done well for himself after retiring, building a successful private contracting business that kept him traveling between Houston and overseas operations. Andrew, his voice was rough with emotion when he called the prison. I just found out what happened to you. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. I should have been paying attention. It's not your fault, Patrick. You've got your own life to live. Maybe so, but you're my brother, and brothers don't abandon each other. I've made good money in contracting, and I've got connections in Houston. I've already reached out to a lawyer there, Amanda Foster. She specializes in wrongful convictions, particularly cases involving veterans who've been railroaded by the system. She's willing to take your case if you've got any evidence at all. Amanda Foster was everything Lisa Thompson hadn't been: experienced, connected, and absolutely relentless. She was 43 years old, a former federal prosecutor who'd switched sides after watching too many innocent people get destroyed by prosecutors more interested in conviction rates than justice. She'd built her reputation defending veterans and others who'd been failed by an overburdened legal system. She visited me at Huntsville 2 weeks after Patrick's call, driving the 70 miles from Houston in a BMW that somehow seemed appropriate for someone who'd made a career of taking on the establishment. I showed her everything Nicholas and I had compiled over months of investigation, the timeline discrepancies that proved I couldn't have opened the offshore account, the metadata analysis revealing email manipulation, the pattern analysis showing manufactured evidence. Amanda listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad, while Nicholas and I walked her through our findings. When we finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying our makeshift intelligence briefing. Andrew, she said finally, this is exceptional work. It's not enough for an immediate appeal yet, but it's enough to launch a proper investigation with real resources. I'm going to need you to trust me and be patient. We're going to do this right, and we're going to make them pay for what they did to you. Within a week, Amanda had assembled a team that would have made any military intelligence unit proud. She hired Scott Rivera, a former FBI agent turned private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. She brought in Dr. Karen Phillips, a digital forensics expert who'd consulted for the Department of Homeland Security. These were professionals with resources, connections, and most importantly, the expertise to prove what Nicholas and I had discovered through prison library research. Scott Rivera's financial investigation revealed the motive that had been missing from the prosecution's case. Michelle's consulting business hadn't just been struggling, it had been hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. She'd invested heavily in a tech startup that collapsed in early 2022, losing nearly $180,000 of borrowed money that she couldn't repay. Then, suddenly, in April 2022, right after the embezzlement supposedly began, Michelle had paid off all her business debts and put a substantial down payment on a $600,000 to $50,000 house in Katy. Christopher's financial situation had improved dramatically as well, with significant deposits into investment accounts that he'd never been able to afford on his operations director salary. Dr. Phillips's digital forensics analysis was even more damning. She proved definitively that the incriminating emails had been created using administrative access, with sophisticated timestamp manipulation designed to make them appear authentic. But more than that, she traced the IP logs that showed someone at Christopher and Michelle's home address had accessed my office computer remotely on 34 different occasions, always when I was confirmed to be off-site. This wasn't amateur hour, Dr. Phillips explained to Amanda during one of their consultations. Whoever did this understood digital forensics well enough to manipulate timestamps and metadata, but they weren't sophisticated enough to mask the IP trail. They knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to cover their tracks completely. But Amanda needed one more piece of the puzzle to make our case bulletproof. She'd subpoenaed the Caribbean Bank to trace where the $450,000 had actually gone, but international banking laws made this process slower than tracking enemy movements through hostile territory. It took months of legal maneuvering and multiple court orders, but finally the records arrived with the force of a perfectly placed explosive charge. The money hadn't disappeared into the financial ether. It had been transferred systematically to 3 different accounts over the course of 6 months. One belonged to a numbered company in Nevada that Scott's investigation traced directly back to Michelle through a paper trail she'd thought was untraceable. The second went to an investment account in Christopher's name that had been opened the same week the embezzlement supposedly began. The third transfer made my blood run cold. Nearly $150,000 had been moved into a college fund for Jason, my grandson. They'd stolen from me and hidden the money in their son's name, knowing that even if they were caught, recovering funds from a minor's educational account would be legally complicated and emotionally devastating. I served 16 months before Amanda filed for appeal based on new evidence. The district attorney fought it aggressively. Prosecutors hate admitting they got it wrong, especially in high-profile cases. But Dr. Phillips's forensic report was unassailable, and Scott's financial investigation painted a clear picture of motive, method, and distribution of stolen funds. The appeal hearing was scheduled for November 2024. I was transported back to the Harris County Courthouse, wearing the same suit I'd been arrested in, now hanging loose on my frame after months of prison food and stress. The building looked different somehow. Smaller, less intimidating. Maybe that's what 16 months of survival does to your perspective. Amanda presented our case with the precision of a special operations briefing. The timeline proving I couldn't have opened the offshore account while attending the Veterans Conference in San Antonio. The digital forensics showing systematic email manipulation from Christopher and Michelle's home IP address. The financial records revealing their sudden wealth immediately following the supposed embezzlement period. The pattern analysis demonstrating manufactured evidence rather than organic criminal behavior. The current district attorney, a different prosecutor than the one who'd convicted me, looked genuinely disturbed as the evidence accumulated. During a recess, Amanda told me he'd approached her about negotiating a settlement. Absolutely not, I said, drawing on the same resolve that had carried me through SEAL training. I want complete exoneration, not a compromise. I want my name cleared and I want justice. The 3-judge appeals panel took 2 weeks to deliberate. When they returned to announce their decision, the lead judge spoke with the gravity of someone delivering a military commendation. Mr. Sullivan, it is the finding of this court that your conviction was a profound miscarriage of justice. The evidence presented demonstrates not only reasonable doubt, but a deliberate pattern of fraud perpetrated against you by individuals in positions of trust. Your conviction is hereby overturned, all charges dismissed, and you are released immediately with our sincere apologies for the failure of the justice system. I walked out of that courthouse a free man for the first time in nearly 2 years. Amanda was already moving to Phase 2 of our operation. We're filing federal criminal charges against Christopher and Michelle, she said as we stood on the courthouse steps. Fraud, forgery, perjury, conspiracy, computer crimes. And we're pursuing civil damages for every penny they took, plus compensation for wrongful imprisonment. The federal investigation moved with the efficiency I remembered from military operations. Once the FBI reviewed our evidence package, they executed coordinated search warrants on Christopher and Michelle's home, offices, and electronic devices. They found everything: detailed email chains between them planning the scheme, Michelle's research into offshore banking and digital forensics, Christopher's notes on which company invoices to forge and how to make them appear legitimate. The digital evidence revealed that they'd started planning this elaborate theft 6 months after Sarah died, when my grief had made me less attentive to daily operations. They'd seen their financial problems as an emergency that justified destroying everything I'd built, everything Sarah and I had created together. Michelle was arrested at her consulting office during a client meeting. Christopher was arrested at Sullivan Security Solutions, the company he'd been running in my absence, acting as CEO while I rotted in prison for crimes he'd committed. Their bail hearing was a beautiful reversal of fortune. Amanda made sure I was there to witness it. The federal prosecutor argued they were both flight risks with proven ability to manipulate digital systems and hide financial assets. Bail was set at $350,000 each. Christopher looked across the courtroom and made eye contact with me for the first time since my arrest. Instead of the cold calculation I remembered from my trial, I saw fear. Raw, genuine fear. Michelle's parents mortgaged their house to make her bail. Christopher sat in federal detention for 8 weeks before finally accepting a reduced bail amount that required him to surrender his passport and wear an ankle monitor. The case that had taken years to investigate was resolved in weeks once the truth emerged. Michelle received 5 years in federal prison. Christopher got 6 years, but prison time wasn't enough. I wanted my company back, and I wanted my grandson back in my life. The civil litigation was complex, but ultimately decisive. Sullivan Security Solutions had continued operating under court-appointed management, growing to $14 million in value despite the scandal. Christopher's ownership shares were seized as proceeds of crime. Amanda argued successfully that every share he'd acquired over the past 3 years should revert to me, since they'd been purchased with embezzled funds. I got my company back, 100% ownership of everything Sarah and I had built. But the real victory came from an unexpected source. Jason's court-appointed therapist reached out through Amanda. My grandson wanted to see me. Michelle's parents had spent months telling Jason that I was the real criminal, that I'd lied to hurt his parents. But children see truth more clearly than adults sometimes. Jason had been having nightmares, and in therapy, he'd finally revealed what he remembered from the night before my arrest. I heard Mommy and Daddy practicing their story, Jason told his therapist. Daddy kept saying, "Remember what we agreed to say." And Mommy was crying. I didn't understand it then, but I knew something was wrong. Our first meeting was arranged at a neutral location with therapeutic supervision. I hadn't seen Jason in over 18 months. He was taller, more serious, but he still had Sarah's eyes and that unmistakable Sullivan determination. He ran to me and hugged me with the fierce intensity that only children possess. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," he sobbed. "I'm sorry they lied about you. I missed you so much." "You have nothing to apologize for, buddy," I said, holding him like I'd never let go. "None of this was your fault. Not one bit." We rebuilt our relationship one Saturday at a time, working on the Mustang, visiting the Space Center, teaching him the values that Sarah and I had tried to instill in Christopher. I told him stories about his grandmother, about building the company, about what it means to keep your word even when keeping it costs everything. I'm 61 now, 2 years older than I should be accounting for stolen time. But I'm free. I'm vindicated. And I have my grandson back in my life. Every morning I wake up in my own bed, make coffee in my own kitchen, and drive to the office where Sarah's picture still sits next to my seal trident. The truth about betrayal is that it doesn't end when justice is served. It ends when you decide that what was stolen from you won't define what you become. Sometimes the people closest to you know exactly where to plant the knife, but that same intimate knowledge makes their deception impossible to sustain forever. Honor and truth have a way of surfacing, even when buried under mountains of lies.